Hi, this is Danielle Mundele, and this is a presentation of the results on the quota management research. Before we get started, I'd just like to give a special shout out to Pete and Shamil for help coordinating the research project. So before we start, it's important to know what quotas actually are. So to take a definition from OpenStack documentation itself, quotas are operational limits. So what that means is that quotas are implemented in order to prevent overuse of cloud resources. So this sort of prevents one individual project from taking over an entire cloud. So we have quotas implemented in several OpenStack projects, including Cinder, Neutron, and Nova. And when they're installed, they come preset with a default value. So if you don't get a chance to update this after installation, there are at least some quotas in place to prevent overuse. And it should be noted that depending how your OpenStack setup looks like, influences some of the pain points that you may or may not encounter when using quotas. For example, if you only have one project that involves quotas installed, you have a different experience than someone who maybe has two or more. A bit about how the research was designed. Our goal was to really understand how quota management is currently happening. What are some of the pain points or difficulties that cloud operators are facing with quotas? And potentially identify some solutions that could be implemented to improve quota management. The method we used, spoke to about 9 people in individual interviews, and we talked a bit about their cloud environment, how that looked, and what their current process was for setting up or modifying quotas, and where they're encountering problems and how those problems could be improved. We spoke to people representing a wide variety of organizations. You can see the logos there at the bottom. So obviously these people all had unique experiences, and the cloud configurations did vary. This slide shows a little bit about the flow of the interview. We started with some background information, so just learning a bit about how people do their day-to-day tasks as a cloud operator, how their company operates, what their cloud looks like, etc. We then focused more on quotas and understanding how they're currently either set up or modified, and how it works when a project requires more quota. We also talked about some potential solutions. How could quota management be improved? What individuals thought of some current possible solutions already out there, and following up with just any other thoughts or comments before ending. I also included here a definition of the persona that best fit our participants in this research. This is Ray, the cloud operator. So this just kind of gives an idea of the profile of the people that we spoke to. There's a link here to more information on the OpenStack personas as well. So to give a top-level summary of what we learned, 2 main themes really emerged, even though everyone obviously had quite a unique experience in quota management. We heard from people that there was a lot of tedious manual tasks, and that the more automation that could be implemented, the easier it might make quotas. We also heard that giving more control to the users that were accessing the projects would streamline the quota approval process, because it would give operators the information they needed to better make those decisions. We have some quotes here on the page that really bring these issues home, talking about how quotas are inconsistent and how it's often a very boring task to modify quotas, and that there are ways that it could really be improved, the operator experience in this situation. So we'll talk about some potential solutions today. A few of these sort of talking about maybe one tool that could be used to help coordinate quota management, especially across projects, and also help operators understand the user needs better and simplify their process of either approving or denying a request for quotas. In the next section, I'll discuss some of the main findings that emerged from the research. So going back to this concept of automation, when we spoke to participants, they really were talking about a wide variety of leveraging automation. There were some people that really did things manually and wanted to especially have an automated situation for starting new projects, which may have a default amount of quota that can be anticipated in advance. There were other people who said that they're already starting to use automation, especially for allocating, as we described, but wanted some more automation in terms of managing cross-project quotas. And we'll talk more about the inconsistency that emerged between different projects using quotas in OpenStack. So really, regardless of whether participants were already using automation or not, there was a desire to automate their process further. On the concept of giving users more control in the quota process, being able to delegate tasks to these people is going to offset some of the operator tasks that are often found very tedious. So a lot of people said that they were using ticketing systems to communicate with the administrators of a project and with the operator that would either approve or deny their quota request. So the more information that they can get up front from those users, the easier it's going to be for the operators to make a decision. It was also seen as helpful to have these users monitor their own resources instead of having an operator have to add themselves as an admin to that project in order to know if they were reaching any limits. All in all, this project was mostly put together to understand what is difficult about quota management. And a lot of people mentioned that these sort of business-related decisions, considering whether they can allocate quota to users, and also dealing with inconsistencies were some of the two main topics that kept emerging. So it's sometimes hard for operators to decide whether or not to allocate resources. On one hand, they want to make sure that their customers have the resources that they need, but they don't want to risk over-allocating and running out of resources in the case where everyone may be using what they're quoted at 100%. So a lot of people talked about the importance of showback, which we'll discuss a little bit later, as a way to sort of provide feedback to customers. They didn't want them to be surprised at the end of the month when they realized that they were using a lot and therefore it was costly for them. And that being able to show this sort of feedback to people controls growth better. And people who didn't have a feedback system felt that they, couldn't control the growth of their cloud environment. Keeping Nova quotas in sync was also very important. It caused mismatches in the system. And this was seen as, a relatively small problem, but really should not have existed in the first place, and therefore it becomes a bit annoying to have to address. So a way to sort of consolidate managing quotas across projects would be one way to mitigate that problem. Next, I'll discuss some other additional findings that came up during the interviews. We did learn a lot about people's cloud environments. We had recruited operators that were working in a production environment, so at least everyone was managing one cloud in production, and that cloud was typically operating at 80% capacity. And this was important to note that operators were a bit concerned about allocating resources at their current rate because they may have to cut back since their capacity is so high. The number of projects varied between participants, some with smaller environments at around 60 to 100, but there were some people operating very large environments and had up to 3,000 or more projects. The number of active users in their cloud again ranged anywhere from about 100 to over 2,500. And this was interesting to note that the ratio of users to projects really didn't follow any specific pattern. For example, it was never the case where there were always more users than projects or vice versa. And this was based on about many different factors, including whether users or a tenant was given a personal project, so that would sort of result in having more projects than users, or whether work projects were able to be accessed by all those project members, or whether there was one person who acted as an administrator for that project. So some factors in there depending on whether there were more users or more projects. We talked about whether the organization leveraged chargeback or showback with participants, and people really saw benefit in these systems, especially when it comes to managing their power users. There were some people that said that they had a system in place to provide feedback to their users, but those who didn't said that this would definitely be something they'd want to do. If they were coming up on their capacity, they wanted to be able to show the people who were using those resources where they sat in terms of everyone else's usage. For people who didn't have a system, they often just said they try to be fair, to make sure that people have the resources they want within reason. There were a few people that said that they used chargeback, but there wasn't really any strategy that prevailed. We had one person mention a bucket metaphor, where a customer would buy a known quantity of resources up front, and they could request more and pay more for them as needed. There was another organization that tracked resources, so they sent feedback based on their utilization on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And there was also talk about how to charge customers, whether they would charge by actual resource use, which was ideal for those on the engineering side, or to charge by quota, the amount that users are allocated, which was more of a business objective. So some of the considerations there with chargeback and showback. We discussed using nested quotas, or otherwise having a hierarchy of quotas for tenants or projects that were being used. And only one person that we spoke to in this particular set of interviews said that they had nested quotas leveraged, but everybody else said that they saw potential benefit in that structure. Many people that weren't using them said that they were probably a bit too complicated to implement, or that they had a smaller subset of users and that the use case wasn't there for them, although they could clearly see it for those in larger setups. There were some people that said, our version of OpenStack is just a little bit too old to maybe even feasibly or possibly implement. such a feature. But overall, people said that they did see use cases, and the most predominant one was that you may have a department that has several sub-projects associated with it. And they could use nested quotas to allocate a larger amount to that department, which could then allocate smaller amounts to those sub-projects and adjust them as needed as the project's goals changed. That way they wouldn't have to rely on the operator to make those changes. The administrator could make them themselves. As I mentioned, larger clouds, probably more ideal for nested quotas. Again, smaller environments may not have departments with several sub-projects, so it might not make sense in those cases. In describing how allocating quotas worked, a lot of operators said that it was really a balancing act. They wanted to make it easy for people to get started, to get down to work, but they also wanted to keep resource use in check. They didn't want to just allocate things to anyone who asked for them without any reason. So this differed between organizations, but we did have several people mention that a small amount of resources is quoted out to users, and that's sort of their personal project that they can get started with. And there were a few people that mentioned that this is an automatic process, that these people, just upon logging in, get their own personal project. Others say that they had a ticketing system in place so that people could request a project if they needed resources or not. And aside from these personal projects, the work or sort of group projects were typically larger and therefore required a longer review process. The operators wanted to make sure they knew where the resources were going. You know, what was the focus of the project? Why did they need the resources? And so there was often a lot more communication involved. Some of this happened via email between that administrator and the operator. Other times there was sort of a template of information, and a bot or an API would then read that and relay the information back to the operator so they could make the decision. When it comes to modifying quotas, most people said that this happens less frequently and that it was maybe slightly more complicated than starting a new process, a new project. So this may be a fact that it happens less frequently so that people may forget the process, but there was a lot of ensuring that quotas were being handled, especially across projects in a proper manner. So often people use the command line interface to modify each project involving quotas separately. But some people had scripts, and usually these scripts were put in place to ensure that everything was matching up. There were a few people that said they used Horizon as part of their quota management so that users could see their usage there and request a modification from the dashboard, and taking them to either an internal app or a help desk to complete that request process. And other people had a Nova scheduler ratio that modified quotas based on compute requests. We also discussed shelving, so the idea of maybe putting a VM on a shelf, so to speak, when not in use, but to keep it active for use later on. And there was really no one way that people agreed unanimously on this concept, really mixed opinions about shelving. Half of the people were interested in learning more or were actively trying to learn how to implement shelving in future upgrades. But a lot of people mentioned that they were using earlier versions of OpenStack, and that said that, when they reach Mitaka version, that this would be something that they'd be willing to implement. And for shelving supporters, people mentioned that it would be great to suspend VMs, and it had the potential to save on resources. However, there were some others that said that there maybe wasn't enough incentive for their users to actually take part in shelving, or it might not even fit in the context of their cloud environment. So there may not be any motivation for users to return resources if it doesn't directly benefit them. Or there might be a fixed number of IP addresses, and that, the IP addresses in shelving would get exhausted because those shelved resources would still be needing an IP address. When discussing how to manage resources, this was often something that operators struggled with. Often there would be some unused resources, maybe something that was started and then not deleted by the user, and then just simply not in use, forgotten about. And a few people mentioned that they try to reclaim those resources and had a script in place that would check for inactive VMs, and after a certain time of inactivity would send a message to the user describing that the VM was going to be deleted after a certain time frame. So typically the script would look for an inactivity period of about maybe 30 to 90 days, and would sometimes offer a chance to extend that use of the VM in case the person simply forgot about it. There were a few people that said that they tried to set up a system like this, but that people found it unfavorable. For example, if people were on vacation and got that notification that their VMs could be taken away when really they didn't have an opportunity to say they wanted them. But other people said that, this is an accepted part of the system, and as the quote on this page says, that if they need more resources that accidentally got deleted, they'll just request more later. There were other participants that didn't really have a formal strategy in place and said that, sometimes they rely on users themselves to return resources. One participant said that they had, a ticketing system where they would request resources, and that people often would put in a negative number showing that they were returning resources they didn't need anymore. Other operators said that that's pretty much what the quota is there for, to just protect against overuse, and that the quota was going to cap people and they could use or not use the resources as they please. Coming back again to the concept of cross-project quota management, this is really one of the hardest aspects of the whole quota process overall, and specifically the mismatch of quota between NOVA and other projects. It made it hard to especially for the user, to understand what's actually available to them based on what's actually on the system back end. And like I mentioned before, it's not difficult to solve the problem, but it should exist as such. There were also some people that gave feedback about a lack of quota in Glance, and that they would like to set maybe some quotas around total capacity or the number of snapshots, things about the metadata, or set a per project or per user value in Glance. There's a few people that mentioned that some creative users were storing data in Glance as an image. So having quotas on this might help manage quotas in that project. And finally, this section will talk about some potential solutions for quota management. So some possible solutions that would be most beneficial to cloud operators include streamlining the quota management with a centralized toolkit. And what this means is that there could be one centralized area to manage all cross-project quotas from one place. And this would help the otherwise manual process of modifying each project's quota individually. Another possible solution would be to delegate control to domain operators. So, for example, in larger environments, you may have a person that's managing their own partitioned piece of the cloud. Right now, they're sharing Quota globally, but if they had their own quota initially given to them, it would help them manage their projects better. Finally, another solution could be to offer quota flavors and also to have a user interface for the implementation of this. So this would give consistency across flavors, and in addition to having consistency through the code in the projects, it would also have an extra benefit to seeing that consistency visually. There were also some other potential solutions given by participants during the interviews. One person saw benefit in having shelved VMs available to do extra data crunching for people that needed a short-term solution. So in the case where a project has resources assigned to them that they aren't using, these VMs would be able to use for anyone who needed extra compute power, but when they are needed in their original project, they would be taken away for their intended use. Another possible solution would to be providing quota on host aggregates as well. So that's our presentation for today. Some of the next steps will be to scope the solutions and start implementing them for future versions of OpenStack. Thank you. Bam. Done.
I'm going to keep that part.
No.